we added some upgrades to the game. Some that were good, some that were bad, and some that went. Then I asked all of you to tell me what your favorite video game boss was and why. Then after going through your responses, I played a bunch of other games like Ravita, Cult of the Lamb, and of course, The Binding of Isaac, and I think I've narrowed down what it is I want in my game, at least as far as bosses go. I think the best kind of bosses for my game are ones that really force you to move around, ones that have attack patterns that make it hard to stay in one place. And obviously, I don't want my bosses to be bullet sponges. They have their place, but this is not that kind of game. Bosses that have patterns that you can learn and predict, and bosses where it feels like they're being presented as a final exam, incorporating previous game mechanics and things that you learned into the boss fight itself. With all of that in mind, I decided to make my first 3 bosses big versions of existing enemies. But hold on, hear me out. These aren't just bigger versions that hit harder. They're also going to have other mechanics that make them more interesting, but they'll be based off the original design, and that way they'll seem familiar, so you'll immediately know how to interact with them. Which I think is a great thing for boss fights, to immediately know how to approach the fight even before you've started fighting. So that was the research. Time to start building. I started with the very first enemy that I put into the game, which was the ghost. Starting by putting the player and the ghost character into a room to figure out what kind of scale I want the enemy to be. And once I had the scale figured out, I went ahead and did the thing that I said I wasn't going to do with most of this game, which is make brand new art. I'm trying to get this game finished, not spending time making new art. But I had to try anyway, and what I made, I really didn't like. So obviously I threw that out, and went back to Kenney's creature mixer. And I got something that was pretty close to what I wanted, without an outline, and then scaled it up, and added the outline to it. I gave it a really basic slamming down animation, so it had some way to attack. And then I started playing with it in scene. Since this was the first boss, it was going to take the longest to make, because I had to make the health bar and the mechanics and how the game interacts with bosses and all that kind of stuff. But before I got to that, I went back to the creature mixer and got a really basic capsule to use as the base for crystals, which will be the thing that you need to destroy to make the ghost corporeal? Is that the word? To make the ghost hittable. So for this boss, you need to destroy these crystals so you can actually damage the boss. And that's one kind of boss that I like too, which is one that forces you to have different focuses throughout the fight, so you're not just constantly focused on the one thing the whole time. But I made these crystals, and then I made a broken version, and put them in scene. And now that I had a way to hurt the ghost, it was time to give the ghost a way to hurt me. So I mocked up a really quick fireball animation, and I wanted to make it so that when the ghost shoots and it hits a wall, the fireball explodes going in opposite directions. So even though there's only one enemy on the screen, there's going to be lots of things to try to avoid. But nothing works on the first try. And then the next thing to do was to give it a second phase, which is something that I really like because it breaks up the boss fight. It gives you something new to do during the same fight, and gives you an idea on how far you've progressed into the fight. And because coding is hard, for this all I did was apply an effect to make the ghost red, and increase their animation speed, which effectively increased how fast they attacked, because their attacks and behavior are tied to their animations. And I think that turned out pretty good. But now I needed the boss to be something that was in the rotation, which meant that I first had to find out where the boss was going to be. Thankfully, I made that decision in the last video, but actually putting it in place is a little more difficult. I put points in the 4 corners of each room, so that if that room was picked for the boss fight, the game would know where to spawn the crystals. And I just had the boss spawn directly in the middle of the room. And then I played through the game a little bit to make sure that it was resetting properly, because the game needed to be able to have the boss fight and then reset all of the variables so you could do it again, and again, and again, and again. And this is where a god mode, or a dev cheat mode, comes in handy. Because the game is meant to be hard, and I need to actually get through it to see all of these bosses, and make sure that they work. Like I said, this boss took the longest because it's the first one, and I needed to put down the foundation with that boss. But the next two will be much faster. And the second boss was based off of the imp enemy, which is basically a big tank that shot enough bullets into the room to force you to dash. Because I found that people weren't dashing in the original game and they were just moving to avoid things. Where I think dashing is a lot of fun, and in games like Enter the Gungeon, where you have your dodge roll, it's kind of the same thing. So I started by picking the base creature from the mixer and scaling it up to size for the boss fight. Then I gave it a really basic slam animation, because actual attack animations are hard to do. And then as I was adding it into the game, I really didn't think it was good enough. I want to make the game quickly, but I don't want to make it bad. So I went back and redid the animation, making the helmet stay up a little bit as the character drops, and then having it land back down on their head. And this animation definitely wasn't perfect, but it was better than the one before. So now I had to add points to the fists, so the game would know where to spawn the shockwave. And change the collision mask because the character is obviously much bigger. And now that I have an existing boss, I could just copy and paste the code down and swap out the ghost's name for the Imp King name. And then I could just preview it, and it would not work, because nothing works on the first try. So I went in and fixed it so the boss would come towards you, and when they slammed, bullets would spawn from their fists and rotate outwards, so you get this circle effect. Because the imp character is a big tank, it doesn't get knocked back when you shoot it. So I took out that bit of code and added in some shakes and stomps and things when they do attack. And I wanted to add a stomp attack every time they stepped, so you'd get the feeling that they're a much larger enemy and heavier enemy than everything else. But I tried, and tried, and tried, and I didn't like any of it. So I scrapped that and got to work on the second phase, which is just them moving a lot faster and attacking a lot faster in a way that will hopefully show off that they're the Juggernaut character. They're a big, bulky, strong thing that you need to get the hell away from. And that was the second boss done, way faster than the first one. So in the bit of code where the ghost boss is spawned, I just added in a second slot and a randomizing variable, so when a boss room shows up, it'll pick one or the other. And then I got onto the third boss, which is for the last of the enemies that was in the base game, which was the spider. They were basically a melee enemy, and they would really chase you down and make you move, which really pissed off players, but it's a really good thing for the game to force the player to move around, and not just take potshots from a distance. So in the creature mixer, I found something that was kind of spider-like, and brought it over to Aseprite. Then I scaled it up, but only to about half the size of the other bosses. And then I worked on giving it a little butt wobble, because that's where the attack was going to be coming from, its butt. And then I put it into the game, copying and pasting down the Imp King code, and swapping it out for this new boss that I'm calling the Spider God. And the movement was working fine, but once it got to your character, it didn't know what to do because it didn't have the fist points that the Imp King had. So I copied the movement code from one of the existing enemies, so that the spider would do this. They would back up if you were too close, and come closer towards you if you're too far away. So they're trying to stay within a certain range. Then I quadrupled the amount of knockback that this boss gets when you shoot it, because the spider is much lighter than the imp or the ghost, and this was a way to mechanically represent that to the player. And then I wanted to give the spider a unique mechanic, which is obviously the webbing. So I stole some code from the existing spider enemy, and used that to spawn some web below them as they walked. Getting it wrong the first time, and then getting it right after. And this would discourage the player from chasing after them, but also just littering the room with things that you want to avoid. And then I wanted this boss to be able to shoot like the ghost boss did, but when the fireballs hit the wall, they spawn spiders, which is a terrifying thought, but that's what's happening. I put a limit of spawning only 4 spiders because the room is only so big and it could get out of hand pretty quick. Now before I move on to the rest of the video, I need you to do me a favor. Could you comment down below with your favorite video game NPC and why? Because in the next video, I'm going to tackle an overworld where you can talk to NPCs, swap out characters, get new guns, that kind of stuff. So Let me know in the comments. Who's your favorite NPC and why? Okay, so now that I had the third boss, I had to put it into the rotation, and I playtested through the game to make sure that they were all working. Again, with God mode on, because otherwise I'd be getting my butt kicked and losing time. I think this was a good start for bosses. We set up the fact that all of our bosses have a second phase, and all of them are going to relate to existing enemies in the game already, so you'll have an idea of what their mechanics are going to be when you fight them. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons. Because of them, my coffee cup is full, and I can even afford creamer. As always, the links to all the cool places that I hang out are down below, and if you decide to click on one, then I'll see you there.